All right, well, the age of exploration, oftentimes known as the age of discovery, begins largely around the 15th century, but we certainly kind of see it a little bit earlier as well. In many ways, the age of exploration stems from the Renaissance and the fact that Europeans are more capable than previously in terms of having technology that allows them not only to sail, but also just gives them the interest to look around and to find out what's on planet Earth. Guided often by the ideas of humanism that human beings can certainly find out more about the world and kind of giving them that individual motivation by which to do so, we see a lot of reasons for exploration. One of the big reasons can be traced back, of course, to the time of the Crusades. As we know, Europeans who are having contacts with the Middle East are exposed to new items, luxury goods, spices, and such. And even in the years after the Crusades, the 11th and 12th centuries, we see that interest continue. And certainly while trade is picked up by Italians of Genoa and Venice and so forth that begin to bring a lot of those luxury goods to Europe, a lot of European countries resent the Italian monopoly on trade goods and are eager to get involved in this trade themselves. They also resent having to pay the high price of luxury goods that come from Asia. As we know, Muslim middlemen along Silk Road routes will bring goods, but of course will charge abnormally high prices for these goods. So the question really becomes is how can we get to luxury goods from Asia, such as China, or porcelain, silk, spice, pepper in particular is really one of those especially important spices. And how can we get to the source the fastest? And is there ways we can kind of cut out the middlemen? So the quest for discovery and exploration really begins from an economic perspective in terms of just trying to discover how to tap into these markets. Now, certainly this is not the only reason for exploration. Of course, trade is a huge one, and the hope and quest to make great wealth is certainly a big deal. But not only this, we also find that exploration really has that Renaissance curiosity about the world, so trying to find out more than what Europe had known previously, especially throughout the Middle Ages. We also tend to find that countries are trying to build their empires. They're also struggling with other countries. There's a lot of national pride that's involved as countries like Spain competes with Portugal, England competes with France. We also have the desire to spread Christianity, especially this becomes even more important with the discovery of the New World and trying to bring the Word of God to Native Americans. Not only this, but we also have other factors such as the personal ambitions and the glory that kind of comes along with being the first to a certain place. The sense of adventure that is brought with new discovery all plays a huge role in motivating explorers to go about risking their lives and certainly traveling places that they had never been before. Technologies that were stemming from other areas of the world but seized upon by Europeans play a really important role throughout this. Cartography, in particular, the process of map making becomes a ever increasingly important goal for Europeans because it's very difficult to sail beyond your safety zone without knowing exactly where you're going. And certainly cartography and the process of map making becomes a lot better as Europeans begin to kind of learn more about the world and as other sailors will come back and make more accurate maps. Astrolabes, devices used for measuring latitude as well as compasses. All these devices had either been invented by China or had been invented by the Arabs. Caravels, new sailing ships that allowed for long-distance ocean voyages, combining both the European square sail as well as the Arab triangular sail, which can catch the wind. Caravels had larger hulls, which certainly allowed for greater goods to be stored in them, and also made ocean-going voyages more reliable and certainly could increase the speed in which it took. So navigational technology plays a huge role in giving Europeans not only the means and the ability, but also the confidence to go out and explore. Now, of course, the age of exploration really gets kicked off with Portugal, and the Portuguese have some of the earliest successes when it comes to exploration. Henry the Navigator, or Prince Henry, a member of the Portuguese royal family, is often associated with the school that he established for sailors. Henry himself was not a huge explorer, but was a fervent Christian who believed very strongly in trying to bring the word of Christ to others. And Portugal had done some limited contact with the northern coast of Africa, but also had done some minor exploration of islands just outside of Portugal, along the Azores as well as the Canary Islands. And Henry's school is the first to train sailors in shipbuilding, navigation, map making. So Portugal, in many ways, is having sailors who are trained in long-distance voyages long before any other country has anything close to this. And the Portuguese, like other countries, are trying to figure out how it is to get to Asia, how to get to the Spice Islands, and the like. So one of the earliest Portuguese names is Bartolomeu Diaz, who is noted in history for becoming the first European to go around the Cape of Good Hope in southern Africa. One of the big problems with getting to Asia is understanding how to get there, but also what obstacles are in your way. And Africa is probably one of the great obstacles, in the sense that many Europeans did not know exactly how large Africa is. And it's very difficult to plan a voyage when you have no knowledge of exactly how long something's going to take. Being able to supply your ship with food is especially dangerous when you don't know exactly how far it is you're going. So Diaz, who sticks very close to the coast of Africa, goes around the continent, and once he kind of glimpses the Indian Ocean, eventually is kind of forced to return back home to Portugal. So Diaz himself did not actually make the journey to Asia, but is associated with being a trailblazer in terms of showing people that it certainly is possible. Vasco da Gama, however, from reading Diaz, is able to not only follow his route, but also to stop at some of the eastern city-states along the African coast, but eventually to make his way all the way to India and to the port of Calicut. And while Da Gama arrived in India, did not actually find all the spice he was hoping for. He didn't really have goods that the locals were willing to trade for, but he comes back not even filling his ship with the goods he was in search of, but just those goods that he had paid for the cost of his trip 60 times over, and really showed Portuguese as well as other Europeans that not only is exploration possible, but it's highly profitable as well. So much of the early Portuguese efforts are really centered around the African coast as well as the Indian Ocean. Portugal is kind of driven by the hopes of finding a fabled Christian king by the name of Prester John, who was not actually real, but tales were told of a great Christian king that the Portuguese were hoping to make alliances with in their fight against Muslims. And so leads the Portuguese to do a fair amount of trade with Africa, but of course they never quite find Prester John, as he did not actually exist. The Portuguese also begin to really rival other Muslims in the Indian Ocean as they establish a pretty decent trading empire for themselves. It's kind of referred to as a trade post empire. Not necessarily colonizing areas, but having major cities that they tend to control and to monopolize trade coming in and out of those regions. Now, the Spanish, who were the neighbors to the Portuguese on the Iberian Peninsula, also want in on this game. They're looking to tap the wealth of Asia. Now, Christopher Columbus is one of the most noted explorers that sails for Spain, but he himself, of course, was not Spanish. He was from Italy. He was Genoese. He had actually even presented his idea first to the Portuguese, but when the Portuguese did not seem like they were going to go ahead and give Columbus the funding he would need, he eventually tried to sell his idea to the King and Queen of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella. And Columbus, who himself is a product of the Renaissance, having studied the works of the ancient Greeks and knew his classics, read the works of Ptolemy and so forth in geography, and had estimated a proximate size of the world, and using the knowledge of the ancient Greeks, knowing that, of course, the world was round, believed that rather than relying upon getting around Africa and sailing east, Columbus would try to sail west. The problem was he dramatically underestimated the size of planet Earth, and believed that his stop-off in Japan was located round about where modern-day Mexico is. So had the right idea, but of course did not quite understand the distance. And Columbus, of course, was looking for Indonesia and the Spice Islands of the Indies. But when he lands in the Bahamas, in the Caribbean, in the year 1492, obviously has no idea that he is landed in a continent that was unknown to Europeans, and even more so, begins to call the people, of course, he finds there the Indians, and thus the name of the Caribbean as the West Indies has stuck, despite the fact that it really has no relation to the East Indies over in Indonesia, in Asia. So when Columbus returns to Spain and then makes 3 trips later on, he sets off a whole change in the history of the world. 1492 really is an important year. While we can debate the significance of Columbus and his discovery, whether he actually was legitimate in discovering the Americas, we can't argue with the impact that discovery of the Americas has upon Europe. It really makes Europeans, once they realize this is a brand new continent, completely rethink everything they knew about the world, and really has them reassess even things of Christianity, and will be seized upon by later thinkers in the time of the Enlightenment as well. But one of the unique things is that when Columbus goes to the New World and returns, he brings with him things that he found in the New World, but also stuff that was native to Europe. And this is one of the first times that the continents are beginning to share things. And it opens up a whole process known as the Columbian Exchange. This idea of moving not only people, but as well as plants and animals, technology, food, disease, is reintroduced to new areas in ways that had never been seen. Obviously, we start to see a mass migration of people to the Americas, not just Europeans who begin acting as settlers to the Americas, but Africans who were brought over as slaves in later years. We've got new plants that come from Europe. Classic things like, or I guess, well, not even just from Europe, but from like citrus fruits that, of course, came from Africa. We have wheat and barley, oats that the Americas never had. And they, of course, also share that with Europe. Things like potatoes and corn, or maize in particular, are really important for European history as they grow really well in Europe and allow Europe to sustain populations rich in vitamins. Pumpkins and squash, manioc, cassava. These are all things that are brought over either to Europe or to Africa, which grow very well in African climates. We've got domesticated animals that come from the Old World, things like cows and pigs and sheep. Horses in particular were not native to the Americas, and when introduced, changed the lives of Europeans dramatically, or the lives of natives dramatically, in the sense that they didn't have this type of transportation. Changes how they hunt and how they move around. Disease is probably one of the more unfortunate aspects of the Columbian Exchange. Smallpox, in particular, old world diseases, which natives had no immunities to, really begin to decimate populations. And the number we often say is 95% of all natives will die off in the years following European contact. And mostly the case is smallpox, but plague and typhus certainly play their role as well. And as we've talked about before, I mean, much of the food that we associate with specific places would not have been possible without the Columbian Exchange. In terms of French vanilla, there would be no vanilla beans in France, or tomatoes in Italy, no oranges in Florida, and the list can go on and on. But the Columbian Exchange really is a whole economic, ecological, environmental, culinary. It speaks on so many levels to the way in which planet Earth changes as we kind of really enter the first global age in many cases. Sometimes for the good, and certainly many times, and probably much more the case, for the worse. Now, the Spanish would also have other famous explorers like Ferdinand Magellan, who was one of the first to circumnavigate the globe. It was him and his crew. It took about 3 years to leave from Spain, go west around South America through the Pacific Ocean. Now, Magellan himself actually died in Asia, but his crew continued the expedition and represents a remarkable achievement for the time period. And we have to think about how brave sailors are, because leaving home for months on end and to pack enough food and to hear tales of sea monsters and so forth must have been very intimidating for most people to undertake such voyages. Now, the Spanish really are going to begin to kind of dominate the Western Hemisphere, and this kind of comes about as in their rivalry with the Portuguese. And the Portuguese, they had their own exploration around Brazil. Some Portuguese early on kind of mistakenly end up in Brazil. But this leads to some competition in the New World. And so the Pope has to step in and establish a line, which is now known as the line of demarcation, created by the Treaty of Tordesillas, that established what areas of the world the Spanish were afforded the ability to kind of trade and explore, and which the Portuguese could. And the Spanish are given largely everything to the west of the line of demarcation, which kind of runs right through parts of Brazil. So much of the Americas goes to the Spanish. And the Portuguese kind of continue on with what they had already done so well, and that is establish control over the African coast as well as large parts of the Indian Ocean. And this leads later on to the Spanish beginning to send out explorers to find out exactly what is in the Americas. And most of these Spanish conquerors are known as conquistadors. The most famous being Hernan Cortés and Francisco Pizarro. And Cortés comes over early on in the 16th century and arrives in Mexico. And of course, this is the home of the mighty Aztec Empire. The Aztecs and the Incas are two of the greatest empires in the Americas. The Aztecs are known as great warriors, having already taken over and subjugated many other natives throughout the region. And when Cortés arrives at the Aztec city of Tenochtitlan, he is amazed by the size of the city as well as the gold that he has seen, and he relies upon some interpreters that they've trained in Spanish to communicate with the locals. And specifically, the Aztec leader Moctezuma is eventually killed when Cortés arrives in Tenochtitlan. And Cortés is eventually thrown out of the city, but learns of the animosity that exists amongst other locals towards the Aztecs. And Cortés will make key alliances with local peoples to attack the Aztecs. There was not a whole lot of love for the Aztecs, especially as they would conquer and oftentimes sacrifice people. And so Cortés, with his modern European weapons and the help of other locals, eventually sacks the city of Tenochtitlan and lays waste to the city, which the foundations for Mexico City would be built atop. And Cortés is a really striking example of how successful Europeans are. About 300 or so men in Cortés' army against one of the mightiest armies in all of the Americas. And it really speaks to the effectiveness of Europeans, their weapons technology, in particular guns. Even though guns may not always kill people, they're not terribly accurate at this time, it's still the psychological impact of guns. Horses, which allows for greater maneuverability for Europeans, allows speed. They're certainly able to kind of cut people down in the panic and chaos that horses create. You have steel weaponry and armor that is more advanced than any type of metal that the Americas has. Obviously, you also have diseases, which even weakens people before Europeans begin to arrive. You also have the sense that the Europeans could be gods. Why fight against them? Never seen white men before, never seen horses or white men carry on horses. These are very intimidating sights that we probably can't take for granted the kind of impact it had upon natives. And many natives kind of give up. They don't fight back because they assume that their gods have deserted them, or this is just their lot in life at this point in time. Demoralization is kind of is certainly a big role that's played by this kind of feelings as well. So while Cortés takes down the Aztecs in Mexico, Francisco Pizarro, who is another Spaniard, having read the stories of Cortés, because of Renaissance inventions such as the printing press, Pizarro understood the tactics that might work well when he encounters the Incas. And upon moving into the Incan land around Peru, he encounters Atahualpa, the Inca leader, and following very similar tactics, the Spaniards are able to gain control over the Inca Empire as well. So certainly it shows us the ability of Europeans to begin to kind of dominate in many of these places, these conquistadors and their lust for gold, the tales of gold from the New World, the desire to spread Christianity as well as their own personal glory kind of motivates these people. And Obviously, when the Europeans arrive, the treatment natives receive is very poor. We can trace this all the way back to Columbus, but many natives are forced to work, acting almost as slave labor on large plantations called quincomiendas, where natives are usually forced to grow old world crops like sugarcane. This is very, very common around the Caribbean, where whole islands are just turned into vast plantations of sugarcane. Or natives being forced to mine, especially for silver in South America as well. Gold, silver, and sugar are really the principal exports that Spain begins to get from the New World. And that's really the purpose of the New World, as well as any colony throughout this time period, where we're going to see how exploitation of resources, or using a colony just to make the mother country wealthy. And that's exactly what the Spaniards are attempting to do with the Americas. And we're going to divide the Americas up into political units called viceroyalities, led by a viceroy who is answerable to the King of Spain. And again, the whole purpose of this is to try to manage wealth and to try to turn profitable enterprises from the resources that the Americas can bring. And you see a lot of things begin to change. I mean, not just the economic systems, but social systems too. When you have the Catholic Church, one of the major agents of change in the Americas, who work with the Spanish government to teach to natives, no doubt about it, most schools are going to be schools that are trained and taught by missionaries who teach native Spanish as well as to teach them Christianity. And Christianity does start to play a huge role. We can see this today, even in the modern makeup of Central and South America, where most of these areas are very, very Catholic countries today. Not only this, but as Europeans come over, they establish themselves on top of a brand new social system where Europeans, in particular the Spaniards, these peninsulares, these Spaniards that come from Spain, kind of fall at the top of the social class. But even other Europeans, like Creoles, that are Europeans who are born in the Americas, also have a very prominent place in the social system. Usually the higher you went up in society, traditionally the more European you were. And then you kind of have your mix as Europeans will start to take natives or Africans as brides. And then so we have children of mixed parentage, European and native being mestizos, European and African being mulattoes. So we have kind of these new ethnic groups that kind of also form their own somewhat middle tier. And then obviously at the very bottom of Spanish society would be slaves as well as Native Americans, which round out a pretty big role as well. I mean, whole areas of the Americas, especially in the Caribbean, 90% of all people in the Caribbean were of African descent. And this is really stemming from the fact that African slaves need to come across to fill the need for labor. Native Americans are dying in mass numbers through disease and also the exploitation by the Europeans. And Africans are really kind of chosen for a lot of reasons. Africans have exposure to similar climates that they'll be working in the Americas. They also have a lot of familiarity with old world crops that they'll be growing in the New World. Africans in most cases were more resistant to disease, since a lot of old world diseases allowed Africans to develop certain immunities. And obviously bringing Africans to the Americas puts them out of their comfort zone, so there was less of a threat of Africans escaping. Slavery had existed in Africa for centuries, so that was nothing new. The Europeans didn't start African slavery. We see Africans being transported along the Indian Ocean to parts of the Middle East. We see members of the Islamic faith taking non-believers as slaves. But in those cases, slaves often had a chance to get their way out of slavery or even to develop prominent positions in society. Europeans don't go to Africa looking for slaves. They're there originally looking for gold and other items of trade. But it's after we establish these massive plantations in the New World that we need huge labor. And Africans will be called upon to kind of meet those labor sources. And so you start to develop a whole system of racially based slavery, which really was somewhat unique in the world. We had not seen a lot of that previously. Where the color of someone's skin defined their labor status. And Africans start to come across in huge numbers. This middle passage, or the transit of Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to the New World, almost all ships carrying Africans were either going one of two places, either to the Caribbean or to Brazil. Most cases, of course, is to work on the sugar plantations. The Portuguese initially start the slave trade, but it's picked up in later years by the Dutch as well as by the English. And of course, we start to see some slaves brought to North America, where the English have established their colonies along the eastern coast. The French have large parts of Canada. So many other Europeans are kind of getting aboard this bandwagon, and they're oftentimes motivated by the theories of mercantilism, which I'll refrain from using the traditional pronunciation of mine throughout the course of this. So mercantilism is kind of unique because it really defines economic systems in the 16th and the 17th centuries, especially, where mercantilists believe that power is money, and money comes from gold, and there's only so much gold in the world. So in order to get more gold, what we need to do is we need to take it from others. It's a fixed amount. There's a finite amount of wealth in the world. So we're going to have to somehow get it from other countries to gain our wealth. And so we're going to see a great focus on exports, where a country tries to have a balance of trade. Any good mercantilist nation wants to have a trade balance in the sense that they export more to other nations than they import. So they are getting more money for their goods rather than spending on another nation's goods. Because if we're spending money on another country's goods, in effect, all we're doing is making them wealthy and them more powerful. So mercantilist nations want to make good on their exports. At the same time, too, any mercantilist nation wants to have a colony. Colonies are huge to the mercantilist. They act as a source of raw materials, and that's especially important because if you are a European country and you want to make manufactured goods, you need raw materials, and most of those raw materials are not found in Europe. So rather than having to pay somebody else for the raw materials, if you're a colony, those raw materials basically belong to the mother country, and the mother country can oftentimes use them as they see fit. So it certainly cuts down upon the cost and allows Europeans to trade and almost make pure profit. What's cool, too, is that these colonies and the colonists that live there will also become a market for the manufactured goods of the mother country. And this is especially important because you don't want your colonists buying goods from another country because all it does is send wealth to them, and you will, through the use of taxes and other regulations, almost force your colonists to buy your goods. This is the pretty famous case with the English colonists in the 13 colonies and a lot of the resentment that the colonists have towards the English, prompting the American Revolution. But there are plenty of other reasons why this is the case. But mercantilists attempting to create huge empires that funnels their business and allows them to create wealth. And this is, again, really Europe's signature. They're growing, they're becoming powerful, and they're entering the world stage. And it's usually through contact with other places they're going to do this, and making these huge sums of wealth. And using slaves, of course, by which to make this even more profitable. Through the 16th and the 17th century, about 11 million Africans are brought across during the slave trade aboard some 350,000 slave ships. Triangle trade kind of goes along with this. The Middle Passage is one part of a larger triangle trade pattern. Now, this is not something that Europeans had figured out necessarily. It's something that historians have kind of noted as they go back and look at trends. But basically, you have the raw materials that are leaving the Americas and are going to Europe, where they are turning to manufactured goods. And now Europeans are going to sell them to different places. But one place they can sell them, of course, is down to Africa, where they are going to trade guns or alcohol or textiles to Africans. And for Africans and chiefs, these are usually status symbols, European goods, since Africans lack manufacturing capabilities. And as a result, they're going to trade African slaves with the Europeans. And the Europeans will load those slaves upon ships, transport them across the Atlantic Ocean, where they'll work on the plantations that make the raw materials that are sent back to Europe. And if you look at these three continents, it does kind of form a triangle. Now, no one ship does the entire thing. It's a kind of a patchwork system of merchants who do their own back and forth in certain areas, but the larger trade network is, in many cases, a triangle, which is kind of cool in the sense that Europe is going to grow especially wealthy off of this. The Middle Passage is the unfortunate legacy of this, the terrible cramped conditions of slave ships as human beings are used and abused just for labor as well as for greed. The period is really interesting, too, in the sense that a lot of mercantilism is very much about the nation getting involved in creating an economy for itself. And mercantilism won't last forever, and it's eventually replaced by things like capitalism. But we do see a lot of those capitalist elements in this mercantilist system. Things like joint stock companies, where different individuals will pay to have a share in a business. Things like the East India Company for the British, the Dutch East India Company as well. And these are all attempts at splitting the cost of things, rather than to risk having a ship that might go down and suddenly you've lost everything on that. So you're only liable for the amount of stock that you brought. So there's a whole commercial revolution that goes along with this in terms of financing and money as merchants all throughout Europe get big on this. The Dutch in particular are really interesting. They're a country that has a lot of merchant activity, and merchants are very big there. The Dutch, they are a little different from others. They're not looking to necessarily conquer, to establish colonies. The Dutch are really looking out for trade. They do have small colonies in, like, Indonesia, but the Dutch are really traders, and that kind of separates them from some of the conquests we saw on the part of the Spanish and the Portuguese, on the English, and so forth. It all plays an important role here. The Dutch were one of the few that was accepted by the Japanese, in particular, where Dutch ships could land in Nagasaki about once a year. So the Dutch definitely have a unique role at this time and are sometimes favored more by other nations than some of the more jealous and conquering Europeans. Now, the Spanish in particular are unique because their monarchs really kind of helped to define this period of time. Ferdinand and Isabella are probably one of the most important early on. I mean, we have to remember that Spain was not Spain as we knew it to be around this period of time. It's divided up into smaller areas such as Castile and Aragon, and Isabella, the Queen of Castile, will go on to make a key political alliance with neighboring Aragon by marrying their king, whose name was Ferdinand. So probably not necessarily a marriage for love, but more a marriage in the sense that it brought political growth. And so Ferdinand of Aragon marries Isabella of Castile and begins to pave the way for a unified state. And this is especially important, too, because it allows Ferdinand and Isabella to complete something called the Reconquista. Spanish Muslims, known as Moors, had largely controlled Spain and the Iberian Peninsula for centuries, while Ferdinand and Isabella, through their united forces, were able finally to take the last Muslim stronghold in the south called Granada, and this allows Ferdinand and Isabella to begin to try to impose religious unity upon Spain. And they do so through the use of things such as the Inquisition, the church court that was used to root out heretics and heresy. Anybody having a view that ran contrary to the church was investigated and certainly oftentimes dealt with by the Inquisition. So a very fearsome thing, the Spanish Inquisition. And we're going to see them start to kind of remove all the Muslims as well as Jews that live in these territories, as Ferdinand and Isabella believe that the key to any stable country is religious uniformity, specifically Catholicism, throughout this period of time. Now, of course, Ferdinand and Isabella do give Columbus some money, but their story is more important in paving the way for Spain, completing the Reconquista, and the wealth that they were hoping to get by new contacts with Asia tell us of the ambition of Ferdinand and Isabella in many ways. Now, Ferdinand and Isabella's grandson, whose name was Charles, Charles I in Spain, but known in history as Charles V, because he was the fifth Charles of the Holy Roman Empire, is a really, really unique figure in the history of Europe, and he's really cool for a lot of reasons. One, because of who his parents were. He was both the King of Spain and eventually elected as Holy Roman Emperor as a member of the Habsburg royal family. So this basically means that you see Charles controlling not only Spain, but large Habsburg holdings in Central Europe. And you can kind of see that in this map here, just how large Charles V's empire was. And we're definitely going to see Charles V a lot more because of how impressive his European empire is. And then you put that on top of the fact that he also had all of the Americas as well, that whole colonial empire. So Charles V is a really interesting guy in the sense that he controls more of planet Earth than most monarchs ever have. and definitely more territory in Europe since Charlemagne, and territory that is really not seen again until the time of Napoleon. So, just in that alone, he's an incredibly important guy. Now, Charles V, also a very, very strong Catholic, is the unfortunate king during the time of the Protestant Reformation. So Charles spends a lot of time trying to deal with the Protestants in the Holy Roman Empire, oftentimes using a lot of Spanish resources by which to do so. And that is not going to work out terribly well for Charles. But also the problem, too, is that Charles has to defeat Muslims, so not just enemies of Christianity in the form of the Protestants, but also enemies in the form of the Muslims, who have gotten all the way to Vienna, the gates of Vienna, where Charles V was able to beat them back there. So Charles V spends a lot of his time dealing with war, and having two countries really puts you at a disadvantage because you have almost double the problems, and Charles is frequently losing money by being engaged in too many things at once. Eventually, Charles V can't handle the stress of the job any longer and gives the Holy Roman Empire to his brother, but gives Spain to his son. So Charles abdicates. He voluntarily steps down, abdication, and Spain falls to Philip II, Charles V's son. Now, Philip, who is also a Habsburg, is one of the more famous kings of Spain, too. He is super, super Catholic, and does much to attempt to build the power not only of Spain but also the Catholic Church. Philip sees himself as the guardian of the Church. Is a big player in the Counter-Reformation, also huge in terms of trying to spread Christianity elsewhere around the world. Philip even has a country named for him. The Philippines over in the east are actually named for King Philip, which was a key Spanish colony that brought much of that gold and silver from the Americas over to Asia. Now, Philip II, however, was an absolute monarch, meaning that he had complete and total control over the government of Spain, which is actually an issue in many ways because it paralyzes the Spanish government. Every decision needed to be approved by Philip, and that really slows government down. Philip eventually will spend a lot of his time also fighting wars. He's fighting the Protestants. He fights the Muslims in the Mediterranean at the Battle of Lepanto. He's also dealing with the Dutch. Large parts of the Netherlands were actually under Spanish control, and the Dutch actually begin to rebel against Philip, and Philip winds up losing losing large parts of the Netherlands as well. Philip also has a huge adversary in England. Queen Elizabeth, the Protestant Queen of England, is often a rival to the Catholic Philip of Spain, even turning his marriage proposal down. So Philip is very entwined with the English, and the English are actually sending pirates under Sir Francis Drake to raid Spanish ships. So there is a lot of national rivalry going on at this time, and these kings play a large role in this. And Spain is going to start to actually suffer for a lot of reasons that sound actually almost silly. One of the big problems the Spanish have is that they actually have too much gold, which is a weird problem to have. But so much gold from the New World actually leads to rapid inflation. Since there's so much gold coming into from the Americas, the value of that money in Spain begins to drop. And as a result, businesses start to decline in Spain. And many merchants have to get their goods from other countries like France or England. Now, along the lines of mercantilism, that's not a good idea to be patronizing other nations' goods and their merchants. Spain is also kind of overextended, fighting way too many wars in small periods of time. The Spanish, by expelling the Jews as well as the Moors, actually hurt their own economy. These were some of the best workers that the Spanish had, and actually leads to some economic decline. The Portuguese were also on the decline. They had actually been taken over by the Spanish during the period of Philip II. But one of their big problems is their empire is just overextended. Portugal was kind of a small country, had a large trading post empire that it was difficult to man, and eventually the Portuguese kind of see their undoing by just kind of biting off more than they can chew in many ways. Now, on the flip side of all this, Asia, which really is the whole reason for the age of exploration, it's where we're trying to get to, they were already advanced, as we've talked about before. And Asia was very reluctant always to trade with the Europeans. There wasn't a whole lot of things that Europe could offer Asia that they did not already have or could not make better themselves. And so one of the great problems, and this is going to be a problem for centuries to come, is that Europeans often have trouble finding things that the Asians are willing to trade for. I mean, Asia's got all these great luxury goods, but if we can't trade with them and we can't find anything of value that they want, well, that poses a pretty significant problem. And in fact, China, early on, eventually decides to kind of close its doors to Europeans. They don't believe that the Europeans have anything of value. And they don't like the way in which the Europeans try to force themselves into Chinese ports, and eventually China largely closes its doors. The Japanese do the same thing too. Japan initially allowed the Europeans in, but especially through the use of like Jesuit missionaries and so forth, the kind of spread of Christianity frightened the Japanese, and then they quickly kicked the Europeans out. And kind of seeing what had happened elsewhere in the globe with the Europeans not fully trusting their power and what they were willing to do, the Chinese and the Japanese both eventually limit their contacts with Europeans. And I mean, the word we tend to kind of use for Asia at this period is isolated. They've kind of isolated themselves off from the rest of the world. One Dutch ship, like we said, did land in Nagasaki yearly. But for the most part, Asia tends to stay out of this. Asia had already explored the area. They had no interest in doing more exploration of their own, and didn't really want Europeans there either. And as a result, this is going to kind of hurt them later on when Europe continues to grow in power and technology, but Asia, through their self-imposed isolation, kind of starts to fall behind the rest of the world in many ways. So the age of exploration is really important for the history of the world. 1492 is such an incredibly important year because it is the beginning of a much larger global age. The Americas and the whole, culture shock, misunderstandings that happens early on, and the whole redivision of the continent by Europeans to what it resembles today is a legacy of this period of time. Europe really begins to grow in power. If the Middle Ages is defined by Europe as a somewhat isolated kind of backwater that does not have the same technology and cultural outputs as the rest of the world, it's during the age of exploration that begins to change, where Europe becomes powerful because of the wealth that it can begin to achieve because of its overseas contacts, its colonies, its empires. And Spain's the big one, but England obviously has a long future ahead of it with its 13 colonies. The French also, by following mercantilism, are going to be able to fund the lavish palace of Versailles and some of its great kings as well. So Europe can really be seen as a major world power because of this age of discovery, as exploration begins to give Europeans an edge in the world.